Kevin Leach is the main director for Sabre Training Advisory Group, a professional military training non-profit based in Ukraine. Their aim is to give Ukrainian defenders the skills to come home alive. Kevin is a Canadian Armed Forces veteran with a long history of working in Ukraine and in military affairs. He served as a sergeant from 2008 to 2018, specialising in armoured reconnaissance. And this isn't the first time we chatted on the channel, so if you enjoyed this conversation, please do check out our previous conversations as well. I'm sure you'll find in them lots of interesting details. And because Kevin is on the ground, we are going to get a unique view into what is taking place in Ukraine and what is unfolding on the front lines and how that potentially translates into the need for logistics and strategy from the Western partners to support Ukraine. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any of our fantastic speakers. And if at the end of this video you appreciate the materials, please make sure you smash that like button. It really does help in the algorithm for other people to discover videos like these. Thank you also to everyone who has supported the channel by becoming a patron or buying me a coffee. And a huge thank you as well to all of you who have supported the documentary film that we are working on. And as many of you will know, that is reaching an interesting stage, and we will have more exciting news for you on the filming, which is set to begin on that. Kevin, welcome back.
Hey, Jonathan, thank you for having me back.
Well, we talk at an absolutely critical time. We've got the sort of fag end of Biden's administration. There is so much that needs to be done before the transition, and there's a lot of stuff we don't yet know fully about Trump's policy. But it is panning out to be a little more complicated, a little more interesting, perhaps, than many people had feared. Well, we're going to touch upon that, but we're also going to talk about what Ukraine must do for itself, what Ukraine can do for itself, because not everything depends on Western partners. And indeed, if Western partners are going to be as, let's say, undependable as they've been over the last 3 years, then Ukraine must do a lot more for itself. So these are some of the things we're going to touch upon today. But to start with, let's get an update on Saber Training, because I understand there's been some interesting developments.
Yeah, huge ones. Since the last time we spoke, we had just, I think the last time we spoke, we had gotten onto an official agreement on paper, as well as de facto, with the Rubige Brigade. Since then, we've kind of stepped up a level to where we now work with the Northern Territorial Command of the National Guard. That's meant a move to a brand new training center. And when I say brand new, I mean still under construction in a lot of cases, but the ranges are in place, so that's what matters. Um, we have had just recently, in fact, last week, we had a visit of 12 or a delegation of 12 from the Canadian Embassy to come in and see our work. And that went about as perfectly as I could hope. We were able to give them a presentation on our work. The base commander gave them a presentation on the progress that's been made on that base and what's still to be done. And of course, the Northern Territorial Command sent one of the deputy commanders of the entire region. They really pulled out all the stops, and it was great because it showed the buy-in that we have earned as an organization. And it's a very exciting step because we are looking to engage with the most engaged partners out here in Ukraine, and to have an effect here on the ground. Um, as I put it in our presentation, I want Sabre as an organization to have a kind of state level actor effects, which basically means doing as much as a government program would, but in our case for a tiny fraction of the cost. And of course, here in Ukraine, being responsive to all of the changes and the lessons learned. Uh, it's one of the benefits that we have as an organization, a non-government organization, is that there's zero bureaucracy when it comes to modifying our training. If we learn about something or we learn that perhaps something doesn't work, It's a matter of me sitting on my laptop, making some modifications to our curriculum, and not going through some kind of committee process. Um, of course, the resources that we lack are a problem, but it's something that we are hoping to take care of very soon. And not I don't mean to be um, plugging us very much, but anyone who's interested in donating is more than welcome to, and I can be assured it will go to only our working costs.
We'll
But
put the links, of
no,
course, into the video. That's very important
yes,
there. Everyone
yes.
should note there are links in the video. Do support the work because, we've had it from various authorities that this is a fantastically impactful way of supporting Ukraine. And as often happens, some of the most impactful things don't always get the most funding. That is unfortunately, that's not just unique to Ukraine. I'm sure that's happened in every war in history. It's not always the most effective units, the most effective forms of training that necessarily get scaled up in the way they should. Karen, I'm absolutely fascinated because we'll talk a little bit about sort of NATO training and the training that's going on with the British Army in a minute, and that's obviously at a distance from the front. But let's first understand when you're adapting your training, where do these inputs come from? Do these come straight from the front lines, from people who've had this direct daily experience? Do they come from central government? Do they come from people who are in the trenches or the officers? What's these routes of communication and learning that you've got to create this adaptable training framework?
So they you nailed it. They come straight from the trenches. We don't currently have a pathway of engagement to say senior commanders or the Ukrainian government. That's what I'm working on. The Western side is to help build up there. Um, but our connections are all our former students. So very often I am in contact with there's a small handful that we had a very long time with, 2 months. And so I stay in touch with a number of our former students from that group, and I ask them all the time, what did you guys use from the training that we gave you? What didn't you use? What do you wish we had? Um, and it's just kind of taking the temperature there. How are things going? What are you guys? What kind of actions are you performing? And so it's entirely from that feedback of if you would you know, frontline practitioners, people that are fighting almost every day, and it that part of it makes it a little bit difficult because they're if they're fighting, they're quite difficult to communicate with, and I'll send a message on Signal, and it's always a small comfort for those people that don't use Signal. You send a message, you have one tick, it's been sent. Two ticks, it has been received, and then two ticks that are colored in, it's been read. And it's always a bit of there's always a lag time when you send the message and you see one tick and you have no idea, is the guy's phone off? Has he died and forgotten to tell me? Um, it's anxiety, a little bit of anxiety, but then you see that it's been read, and then you get the message back after maybe a day or two because they were out fighting or weren't near the Starlink. Um, but a very, very long answer for a short question. We get all of our feedback straight from the front. And we're now working on ways where we can push the lessons that we have learned on to the formal authorities in right now we're looking mostly at the Canadian and British governments because we have the strongest ties there. The Americans are a little bit difficult to reach just because uh, it's a transition time for them. And yeah, maybe more on that later.
That's interesting as well. And in terms of passing these learnings up the sort of vertical of power, how does that work in Ukraine itself? Because one of the other pieces of news we've had, which actually hasn't really got much coverage, but I think it's absolutely fascinating, the commander of ground forces in Ukraine has just been appointed, and apparently it's kind of an interesting appointment. It's somebody with a lot of experience, somebody like Zaluzhny, who has a very sort of positive, let's say, sort of swell of support from the ranks, rather than being someone sort of plucked from the hierarchy. So How does the sort of learnings that you're talking about, the work that went into the training and the innovation that's happening on the trenches, how does that work its way up the command chain to help better strategic and tactical decisions, at more senior levels? And is it possible that the appointment of this new commander is perhaps reflective of an understanding of what's kind of going on and what's needed?
It's the first thing is that so Mikhailo Drapati is his name, and he's a leader from the or a hero, pardon me. Well, he's both of those things, but a hero from the Maidan era. There's a very famous footage of him smashing a BMP through a pro-Russian checkpoint, and he was later, I believe, the brigade commander of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which is a absolutely legendary brigade, although one that's fallen on some pretty hard times recently, mainly through overuse. But yeah, so you nailed it, where he has that support among soldiers because he's very respected as a leader, as someone who doesn't throw his men's lives away. And not to say that he doesn't ask them to do dangerous things, he just doesn't ask them to do it pointlessly. And it's a strong indication of you're seeing within militaries there are, we'll say, administrative leaders and operational leaders. I think that's a polite way and neutral way to put it. In peacetime, the administrative leaders really are in their element because they're working internal politics. They are padding out their careers. In wartime, it falls to the operational leaders to actually get the job done, and we've seen both up close. Um, Everything that I'm hearing indicates that Drupati is a operational leader, which is exactly what we need. So, as far as that, time will tell. But as far as that goes, uh, the it's a good sign. Um, in terms of to come back to the question about information moving up within the Ukrainian system, so it's one of the major strengths, but also has its drawbacks, which can be compensated for, but you need to actually work on that. Um, and that's in the Ukrainian system, it's very decentralized, far more than Westerners are used to in our militaries. And so you will see a lot of these lessons learned passing very, very well within the battalion level and passing more or less at the brigade level. But there's a big breakdown passing those lessons up above the brigade level and between brigades. And so you have such huge variation in experience levels, training levels, and quality levels between brigades. So the system does exist. There is a lessons learned cell. There's a training and doctrine cell here. Within both the National Guard and the ground forces, the ZSU. But how basically it seems to me, and I'm again, like I'm not very experienced at this level because we haven't kind of climbed the ladder to that point yet, although we're very close. So it seems to me that people imported Western structures that work very well in a Western context, especially the cultural context. And it has taken time. There's been a kind of a learning curve, an adaptation curve, taking these Western structures and modifying them to fit Ukrainian cultural context. There's all sorts of stuff built up that causes problems with a traditional our idea of a traditional lessons learned process. So one of those big barriers is that we're still dealing with forget like Soviet tactics. We're dealing with Soviet era cultural scars. So in our context, if we make a mistake in training, we go, okay, here's this mistake that we made in training. Here's how we fix it. Let's implement that. We'll try another iteration. We'll see how it works. In its most ideal form, that's our process. In the Soviet process, it's, oh, you made a mistake. You must not be competent. We're going to take away resources or position or whatever. And then there's no possibility of iterative learning. It's just it's pass 100% or fail 100%. It becomes a completely binary state. And so of course, that's why we see so many people like in Russia and earlier in the Soviet system completely gaming things and just lying and saying, yes, perfect. We in our training exercises, we win every time. Um, because there can be, there's no failure. Failure is not an opportunity for growth. In the Soviet mindset, failure is something that needs to be punished. And so we still have remnants of that attitude left over. You can't spend, say, 20, 30 years of your life growing up in a certain kind of cultural environment and then just cast it off immediately. And so there are a lot of senior leaders in Ukraine who are well-intentioned, but still scarred by that environment. And so, and then of course, there's organizational momentum. Bureaucracies are notoriously hard to reform and change. And so, if you've had 90 years, in this case, of Soviet occupation and what would I call it? 90 years of Soviet occupation and that bureaucratic momentum. It takes a long time to reform it, because what a lot of people maybe don't remember is that Ukraine in 91, upon resuming independence, didn't like zero out everything. The bureaucratic structures have all been adapted from what was left behind by the Soviets. So it's a lot of different things coming together, but it does make the passage of lessons learned a little bit difficult, and that's without getting into things like the ego of various commanders. Um, you know, there was once a little bit of theater. I've had a lot of theater actually put on for me, um, depending on what kind of support individuals think that we have from the West, if they think we're something like a CIA cutout with unlimited funds, or if they think they're going to profit off us. Um, there's more or less theory, or if they theater, or if they want their ego plumped. So I've had everything from a big show, which is having this commander have all his little peons come and meet, come to the meeting, and they're saluting him very sharply, incredible drill and all this junk. Uh, Everything from that, from meeting a brigade commander. This was perhaps a prudent move on his part, but meeting a brigade commander in the East, but being taken to one location and meeting someone and being told, okay, being checked out, and then, okay, we're going to go to another location. And we go there, and the first thing we see are two bodyguards with their hands on their pistols. That was on the less theater side. Um, and it's always like, in this case, it's kind of just feeding in to make sure that we know how important that commander is. By far the most important commander I've ever met had absolutely no pageantry. We met in his friend's tattoo parlor, and it was hi, introducing each other with first names, and I didn't realize the amount of influence that guy had until much later, when doors that had been impenetrable to us before just started just opening for a breath, just and they pop open because we now have this level of patronage. So that's always something too that you have to deal with, because if you have a commander who has a really, really big ego that requires a lot of servicing, that does not lend itself to an iterative learning process. It can never be, because a mistake that's made by one of his subordinates could potentially be interpreted as a mistake that he was made. In our theory of command, when I say our, I mean like the NATO theory of command. Yeah, the commander is responsible for everything that happens below him. But So it's someone like that is not going to allow for the review process that is required to really take advantage of lessons learned. We're now plugged into a network of officers that are uh, they're not that way. They're not leading with their ego. They're leading with results and their desire for results, and that's that has opened things up a lot for us. So it's again a long and detailed answer, but the lessons learned process exists here. It's just going to take a little more adaptation, but we're here for it.
And that simple idea would seem to have a huge impact, especially in a war situation, because of course it applies to the bureaucracy as well. And if I've understood this correctly, you shouldn't be censured necessarily for making mistakes unless they are really stupid ones. You should be censured for failing to learn from mistakes and implementing corrective measures. Is that I've got that sort of understood that that's the idea. Whereas in the Soviet mindset, you get punished for original thinking. Now, you may have come up with a brilliant idea. You may have come up with an idea that's absolute junk, but just the process of coming up with an idea is interpreted as some form of insubordination. Because if you have a brilliant idea, you know, your commander hasn't, it shows them up. It's an implicit criticism. If you have a bad idea, again, the same thing is it's about deference. It's about status and hierarchy, and suppressing innovation. So if I got that sort of understood that you're trying to sort of break that mold.
Absolutely, you nailed it. It's coming from that Soviet example. Oh, good idea. Yeah, it worked. But did I tell you to do that? And it's whereas with us, we have so that's called detailed command when you have the general who's going down to the corporal's level and trying to control every single link on the chain in between there. Then you have mission command, which is the general says, "Hey, here's my big goal," and then he lets the colonels split it into their sub goals and and on down all the way down to the corporal whose goal is get to that building across the street. And every link in the chain, rather than being controlled, has the latitude to make their own decisions. And that's what we're trying to get in here, because it has that philosophy has many different forms in the lessons learned, in the style of command. One of the things, it's one of the best examples of that, I think, was probably Patton, where a lot of the other generals would replace their guys if they made a mistake. Patton would say, "Hey, learn from that. You're not going to do this a second time because you've seen the cost of it." And it allows for more effective uh, uh, commanders. Now, there's a certain limit. Like if you're say a brigade commander who's now on his the sixth version of his brigade because you've wiped it out five times before, yeah, it's you need to go. But if you're a company commander that had perhaps some bad information and had a fight go poorly for you, that's not the reason to fire you. That's the reason to say, hey, welcome to war. Now you need to learn. Say, for example, before you assault a position, to keep surveillance on it for 24 hours before, leading right up to it. And then that lesson is something that I have from something that was relayed to me by some Western fighters out here, which they had a very catastrophic contact with the enemy because they had expected a bunch of Storm Z conscript garbage, and some maybe 6, maybe 12 hours before they assaulted the position that they were going to move on, the Storm Z were swapped out for actually fairly well trained VDV. So they met a very different type of resistance. And so it's I don't know if anyone learned a lesson from that. Uh, I didn't I didn't follow up on any higher levels with that one. It was just relayed to me by some of the guys that had been there. Um, but it is, yes, it is. It's getting away from the Soviet total control to the NATO, and even, to be honest, it's much better suited to Ukrainian culture. This is the decentralized decision making at different levels. We taught a lot of mission planning, or we have, well, historically we have, and we continue to. One of the things that we've seen is that Ukrainians absolutely love our style of mission planning because it allows for all of their flexibility and creative thinking, but it also lets the process that we use itself put into the hands of our Ukrainian students allows them to have everyone come forward and share their ideas on the mission. And sometimes privates often have very stupid ideas, but every once in a while a private has a good idea, and especially if that private is, say, 35 years old and has had some life experience, perhaps even fought before. So the way that we do things, it's, I won't go into detail here, but it allows for those voices to be heard, and then just by Ukrainian soldiers, just by feeling that they have been listened to, will adhere better to the orders of their commanders. That's what I've seen time and again here. Um, if a Ukrainian person feels like you're ignoring them or trying to command them, this is more, I would say, the younger ones, the ones who haven't been kind of tainted by that Soviet learned helplessness. If they feel like you're just brushing them off, then you get absolutely terrible results because their attitude is like, okay, well then I guess to hell with you if you're not going to listen to me. Whereas if you take the time, and a private, even if a private has a dumb idea, and you don't, provided you can't go, hey, private, that's a dumb idea, and then brush it aside, but you say, yeah, cool. Here's why I don't want to do that. I have a reason why I don't want to do that. That usually smooth things over very well, and then the private will know, okay, well they listened to me, and he had a reason for not wanting to do my idea, so great. I'm gonna listen. Um, it's much more suited to the natural, I would say, natural Ukrainian Cossack culture, where it's not a that's something else too that we need to, those of us who are coming here to help Ukraine, or those of us who are helping Ukraine from outside, something we need to understand is the traditional culture of Ukraine, which you can see as a historical constant, and that is just the independence of the people, that they do not make good conscripts, really. They don't, when you yell at them and you treat them, listen here, you peasant, do what I tell you because I'm above you. That does not go well because it runs against the love of freedom and the individual sense of almost sovereignty is what I would say. I see that in my wife's family. So they're all villagers, and of course, there's that kind of like city villager prejudice that still kind of hangs on sometimes, although there's much less of it now than there was 10 years ago, because that is a very Russian thing. Ukraine traditionally has been close to its villages. Anyhow, but they're simple people. They're not highfalutin political types. But they nonetheless, it's like the self-ownership that is there. Like, yeah, I'm my own person. I'm going to make my own decisions. It's very democratic in like the purest sense of democracy. It's very inspiring to see because they don't they don't feel themselves to be slaves or just kind of objects to be pushed by historical forces. They see themselves as actors, even in small ways. But that is something that must be calculated for when we are assisting Ukrainians. And at the high level, it's very good because talking with defense attaches, talking with people from higher level positions, they do get it, and they don't try to tell the Ukrainian government what to do. But it makes it hard maybe to introduce new ideas. You have to be nuanced, and you have to say, thank you. I understand the way that you guys are doing things. Please let us show you how we do things. And the good news is that Ukrainian culture is also very syncretic. And so if they see something that works, they have no problem taking it on board, adapting it for their uses. And so it's just a matter, I think, of getting a big enough platform and enough people to show and say, here's how we do things. Here's how we have solved this problem in the past. And that's the core of the lessons learned process, and at every single scale.
But there's so many
Uh,
ways to take that. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. I think gets to the heart of things. If there are anybody of, let's say, a Republican persuasion listening to this who are saying, yeah, in theory, we support Ukraine, but there's other things going on and, et cetera, et cetera. This gets to the heart of it because the freedom you describe here is based on a sense of personal responsibility. The root of that personal responsibility is rooted, as you say, in quite a healthy communal village life, but it's also based on a concept of private property and private business and taking ownership of the land and taking ownership of your problems and then liaising with people, working with people locally to improve standards of living. But it's rooted in these concepts which ought to be absolute music to libertarians. It ought to be music to anyone who is supporting, let's say, MAGA, because they feel that the state has got over mighty and is sort of crushing individualism, and they feel that the media is distorting everything. They should have some extraordinary commonality with Ukrainians. They should be thinking, hang on a second, you've got these extraordinary freedoms that have evolved over centuries being crushed by essentially a slave army that is still stuck in the mindset of communist Russia. Come on, it's quite clear who needs to survive and which set of values need to triumph here.
yeah, it's I try and stay out of the political labels and stuff like that, particularly because I don't I am very I have a lot of enmity towards the way that we do politics in the West. But if you take it just as a values approach, a lot of the common values in Ukraine are ones that would be coded as more conservative in the West. And it's they really fit my values. That um, one of the so like just this is an example. One of the books that sold the most, it was one of the huge bestsellers after the fall of the Soviet Union, was Atlas Shrugged. And Rand actually herself, Ayn Rand, for the author of Atlas Shrugged, for anyone who doesn't know, spent some of her early years in Crimea when her family was fleeing the Bolsheviks. And so it's these are natural Ukrainian values that again have been demonstrated throughout their history. There was, I believe, I don't know if I've referenced it on here before, but in Ukraine, a history by Orest Subtelny, I think. I know Subtelny, but I always screw up his first name. Anyway, uh, he writes about a Christian monk who was traveling through Ukraine, and I think it was the 12th century, and he was on his way to visit the sort of the Eastern Christians or Northeastern Christians, and he went through the territory that would later become Ukraine. It was, I mean, it's still Ukrainian, but people didn't necessarily use that term for it. Um, what was remarkable for him, and he wrote this down in his sort of chronicles of his travels, was that he'd go through villages and he found that the people there were all literate. It was a kind of an initiative of the priests at the time to ensure that everyone could read. And he's going through these villages. He finds these people that can read. They're all kind of smallholders. They're not serfs. They don't belong to a lord, and they're not tied to the land and all these little fun ways that people disguised slavery. They owned their own homes. They owned themselves, and it it was remarkable. They're incredibly open. They want to know where you're from. They're full of questions. And I remember the first time I read that book was when I had shortly after I had arrived here in Ukraine, and I had seen the exact same thing, and the self-possession and the sovereignty in regular people here. And this is something that well, I know I'm not okay. I'm not so heavily involved in media stuff. I have my main job, which is just to get this training off the ground. But when I have the opportunity like this to engage in kind of like media stuff, I really am trying hard to get the message across to uh, conservatives in the West that there's so much in common here. There's something for everyone in Ukraine, and I think in large part because Ukraine is so it operates so differently from our political scene, the Western political scene, and I think that's a very good thing. I think it's a lot less toxic. But and I'm not alone in this. JP Lindsley, he does a lot of work to kind of show the shared values between Americans and Ukrainians, and it does a lot of times in its practical effect slant towards stuff that is in the West viewed as conservative. And that's now going to be very, very important to spread that message because with a uh, people can quibble over my use of these terms, but with a more conservative administration, set to take over in the United States, hey, let's show those parallels. Let's show that there's something to be related to here, and I think there's very positive signs. Like the appointment of Keith Kellogg as a special envoy. Mr. Kellogg's already been out to Ukraine, and there's a photo of him I saw recently with a small crew of people in front of one of the Donetsk region signs, and it's been slapped on with a bunch of stickers and graffiti and nonsense. So he was here at an earlier point when it was a significantly more difficult trip in a lot of ways to get out to Donetsk. So that I think that's a good sign. I think that we're seeing good indications, and so it's just a matter for those of us who can, with our positions, communicate these parallels and that show that Ukraine is a partner and a like nation and worth supporting. I think that's very important.
Let's touch upon this Soviet mindset because there's something really interesting you've described here, which is the idea of tolerance for failure up to a certain point, or tolerance for mistakes, as long as those learnings can be incorporated. Um, it seems from various conversations I've had that this kind of Soviet mindset is far more embedded within the bureaucratic architecture of Ukraine. Not universally, because of course we know there are pockets of excellence, but as a culture, it seems that a lot of people in the administration and bureaucracy are going to be risk adverse. You know, picking up on ideas, picking up innovations comes with a risk because what if they don't work out? But in wartime, of course, you need to take those risks. And, there are great examples in the Second World War of Britain doing extraordinarily inventive things which never have been contemplated in peacetime. And not all of them paid off. Some of them paid off absolutely sort of big time. Things like investing in sort of, cracking the Nazi codes and some extraordinary kind of innovations around D-Day and various other things. So you need to have you need your hierarchy to be broadly open to those innovations, even if you know that certain people are going to have a mindset that sort of resist that. That's almost inevitable. But it does seem that this risk-averse culture is deeply embedded within the Ukrainian government. How can it be tackled? And has it had a detrimental effect on the war? And in fact, at this critical point now, that really needs to kind of be tackled. I mean, the pores of the skin of the administration need to open up to be able to absorb ideas and test ideas, don't they? Because at this point, I think Zelenskyy was very clear on that it's the side that can innovate best and innovate fastest is going to end up winning. That's never been more true than it is now.
So the a small note on Zelenskyy, his perspective first. He's a little more, I would say, tech forward than I am. Sorry, this seems a little uh, self-aggrandizing to frame it in these terms, but I'm a little bit more of a purist in my military perspective. Keep in mind, I'm not a general. I'm sure there's certain shortcomings that I have that I'm not necessarily aware of, but my my opinion is that it's not technology that's going to lead us to victory, um, or it's just a technology that we already have, which is quality training. Um, I think that technology is great. I'm not against it, but technology is an enabler. But it's not the core of a military. The core of a military is its infantry. That has always been the case. That always will be the case. The infantry, they close with and destroy the enemy. They take and hold territory. And those are the two things that funny enough, we need to do in this war. And so, Zelensky's been amazing on the technology side, but I think that he has not emphasized training enough. And I would think that being someone who trains soldiers. But nonetheless, I think that there is innovation in training. Training is a technology. And what we what we need to be doing alongside our technological innovation is taking advantage of the training innovations that we have. There's a lot of ways technology can enable training, and we need to start leveraging those. I'm thinking battle simulation systems. I'm thinking certain types of simulators. I was able to sit on a panel at a defense tech conference, and it was very interesting. I was the only soldier on any of the panels, or former soldier, depending on how you want to think of that. Um, and I was there to kind of grab the nerds and say, "Listen, nerd, uh, uh, you know, here are certain military realities that we have to deal with." Because it's not, look, tech innovators are great. They don't know what they don't know. It's the same as if well, quite frankly, you put me at a defense tech conference, and there's a lot of stuff that I was simply not aware of in the industry, and I learned a lot there. And so what we need to do is get more crossover of knowledge between these two eras and areas, pardon me, and then we'll work better together. But one of the things that we need to be doing is ensuring that we do not send anyone to the East that has not been prepared properly. And when I say prepared properly, that means, at a minimum, 4 weeks of 4 training weeks. That means 20 training days, because the other thing is a lot of guys like to burn themselves out by working 6 or even 7 days a week. You will just run people into the ground and they won't retain information. Um, 6 days maybe, but you need some rest. We prefer to do 5 days. Anyhow, a minimum of those 20 training days, and it has to be very concentrated training. There's an unfortunate habit that we've seen with Ukrainian training plans, where they lay it out almost like an elementary school training plan. So, for an hour in the morning you have this, and then you have an hour of this, and then you have an hour of this, and you have your different classes through the day. Your medical class, your science class, your electronic warfare class, and your rifle class. That format of training, it works in an elementary school. It does not work for military training. What we have found is it's better to have thematic days. So you're going to have a day where you're working on fire and movement, and we're just going to have so many repetitions of fire and movement through the day that it's going to kind of be compacted. And then the next day you're going to work on something else. But also, as you go through the training, everything gets a little bit more complex, where you are using the earlier lessons learned. So on day 6, you're learning some like squad tactics, maybe reaction to contact. But reaction to contact is using the same skills that you learned on day 1 with your fire and movement. It's now in a more complex environment, but it's reinforcing those earlier lessons by relitigating the same skills. Training innovation is going to make the biggest difference here. Integration of simulators. So it's very difficult for us to get machine gun rounds to train our students with, because most belted machine gun rounds end up going to the fighting. Completely understandable. So we're working with a company called Strata 22 here. Working with, I'd say lightly, they're helping us find some donors who can pay for a weapon simulation system, because it's quite costly. It's $12,000. However, with this weapon simulation system, okay, we get that. We get the say a PKM machine gun. I can now teach students all the principles of machine gunnery without expending a single round. We still will insist on confirmatory rounds, but if I can train someone to be a decent machine gunner, to be familiar with the operation of that weapon, firing 100 confirmatory rounds and say 10,000 simulated rounds, as long as we have to make sure that the results are the same. So that's going to take some A/B testing. But that is a huge enabler because that means that there's an entire class of resources that we don't even need to think about because we have these simulations, our simulators. And it's teaching, when you're working with that weapon, you're learning the same muscle memory. And so in that way, that's no different from operating the gun, uh, the real one that shoots lead versus the one that shoots lasers. Um, and then the other thing too is like battle simulation systems. So one of the most valuable things that we found for our students is having them. You start out first assessing their current skill level. You identify the skill gaps. You fill the individual skill gaps. After you've done that, you begin work on collective training. You start at the squad level. You move up through platoon up to company level. That's typically where we finish out with the size of our organization. But by our students in the summer of 2023 that we had the longest with, we had 2 months with them, 100 students. By the end of our training with them, we were just kind of assigning them company level missions and then watching their planning process, giving them feedback where appropriate, and then watching them carry out the mission tasks that we gave them, and then having some little things happen, either having an enemy force move against them that they had to react to, have simulated indirect fire, so they had to now deal with their casualties and complete the mission. And something that would be incredibly helpful for a group like ours is to have battle simulation systems. So either blank firing rifles or rifles that simulate recoil with a kind of gas system, and then are like very advanced laser tag. It allows you to simulate casualties of all different kinds, but the more advanced battle simulation systems also will have like a GPS overlay, and they'll say, okay, so we took a large number of casualties on this approach, maybe because you guys came through the wrong, you used the terrain the wrong way. You were able to, here you guys were able to flank the enemy position, and you did, the largest number of casualties on them uh, in this stage of the attack. It gives you a lot more granular data, but it has that real feedback. So like if you're a goofball and you just take off running through an open field, um, you know, it's somewhere between the no punishment for a stupid action and the losing your life over a stupid action. And if we can teach somebody that running through an open field, I'm using a very obvious example. If we can teach someone that running through an open field is stupid in training with a very low cost to them, it's phenomenal because down the line they won't do that stupid action in a way that costs them or their team their lives.
And of course, they're
Um,
fighting against Russian troops, which, in the main part, and then all ethnic Russian, of course, we know as well. There's North Koreans. There's all. They don't necessarily have the time and resource, or even the architecture within their military to do this level of training, and they certainly don't have the hierarchy in order to enable people in those positions to think and adapt their techniques. They essentially say, "You go there, and whatever happens to you happens." And we see numerous videos of Russians, these sort of, begging the Tsar kind of films, or films of little pockets of Russians who've the only ones who've survived in their company. You know, there's sort of 12 out of 15 are dead, and there's three who are full of holes sitting in a trench making a video. They always describe the same things. We were told to come over here. We were shot to pieces. We can't go back because, well, we know what will happen to them if they return from one of these suicide missions.
yes, and that is we have an advantage in that there are hard cultural barriers that the Russians can't cross. They have had a slave society for as long as Russia as an empire has existed, and before Muscovy as a kingdom, they operated on the exact same principles. And just like freedom and individuality and self-possession are constant historical constants in Ukraine, slavery and feudalism and learned helplessness are historical constants in Russia as an empire and in Muscovy as that earlier predecessor kingdom. And that's good. That's an advantage for us. But it's not to say that we don't have officers that are like that within our forces. One of our instructors is he's Georgian originally, served in the Georgian army. He came out here in Ukraine back in I think it was 2021. I'm not 100% on that though, but he came out before the invasion. Um, like myself, he immigrated here, married a local woman, and settled down. But he's fought, uh, since the invasion, and he did see some of these Ukrainian commanders that are just like, no, my only order is go over there, just go over there and destroy that thing. And it's something that we need to work within our own system here to push that out and to make that unacceptable. That's a larger cultural change that I'm not saying Sabre is going to have much of an effect on that, but a little one. And I think that by isolating areas where we really can make a difference via training is how we're going to make that happen. I think the larger cultural changes are actually on their way. I've met with some civil society people, and I'm working to meet with more, especially in soldiers' rights groups. I met with a young man from an organization called Princip, and they're all about soldiers' rights. They're all about getting adequate training. They're all about informing soldiers of the legal rights that they have, whether or not they're conscripted or what. And these are big things because once history again has borne this out, recent history, once the Ukrainian people broadly become aware of an issue and say, this is something we need to solve, and they start to exert pressure and express frustration, the government either solves the problem or gets replaced. And the government here has my God's fresh in everyone's mind. The government here is also a lot better than the Yanukovych government. Um, that's a boy, what an understatement. But anyway, they are responsive to this social pressure, and it just takes a small thread of protest, usually to get things really moving, and I think that that's building up. There were a lot of civil society groups that exerted pressure and were able to get their leaders meeting with Sierski, and out of that, I think are going to be some good results. There was a law passed recently that soldiers require 2 full months of training, so 50, I believe it's 50 days overall, five for administration and 45 for training. That those are positive changes now. I mean, there's the law and then there's what happens, and we need to make sure that those two line up. Our preference, as I've said earlier, is to have those 55 days spread out in 5-day working blocks, 2 days off, let the students rest, because when you do military training right, it's physically draining and mentally as well, because you should be thinking as much as you are working with your muscles. So proper rest is important for retention of information. But it's all of that to say that the changes are, I believe, coming, and they are Ukrainian led. It's not from outside, because it's another thing, which is a historical constant in Ukraine. Ukrainians are incredibly resistant to anything that even vaguely smells like coercion. Um, and that it's a good thing. I actually think that there's very, very little downside to that. Uh, we have a different approach in our Western militaries, and I say this having been a very strict instructor for 6 years of my 10 in the Army. Um, we are very authoritarian, and it's very much shut up and do what I tell you, private. And that doesn't get you very far here. Yelling at Ukrainians, it gets you one of two results. They feel bad and they beat themselves up pointlessly, or they kind of go, okay, this guy's not speaking to me like a human being, so to hell with him. And neither of those are productive results. So you have to have a different way. And as sometimes people still do need to be yelled at if they're doing something unsafe. I have
I think
Muscle
if
discipline.
someone explains to you, yell them. It's like dealing with a child, isn't it? Right? If you just
It,
yell at them and don't give them a logical reason of why they've done something that could potentially harm them, and in
yeah.
that context, I think it's important to talk to a child as if they're an adult. You give them really good, strong, rational arguments why that behavior, is wrong, rather than just yelling.
Yeah, and you just reinforce it. You just reinforce it. Yeah, sometimes there's a look. I've had loaded rifles pointed at me because the guys were just frankly clueless. And now you don't yell then. You don't want to do anything alarming at that point, but you definitely in that moment you're going to take a hold of the rifle barrel and you point that away from you, and then you're going to say, "Don't fucking point a loaded gun at me." Um, that's where you have to be a little, there's got to be a little sting in it because they need to realize the gravity of what they're doing when they're careless with a weapon. But the rest of the time, if someone's just making mistakes, and especially I've seen this sometimes with other instructors. I'll say it's strongly discouraged in Saber, but yelling at a Ukrainian guy in English because he's making a mistake, what it achieves nothing. He doesn't understand what you're yelling at him for. He knows you're yelling at him. And that leads usually to those two bad outcomes of either to hell with you or oh, I'm a failure. And we do not want to program our soldiers with learned helplessness. We want them
Yeah.
to be confident, aggressive. Our we want them feeling deadly. And the best way for them to feel deadly is to make them deadly so that they know when they're going into a fight, they're like, okay, hey, unless this is some hardcore meat-eating SSO Russian, I'm way more aggressive. I'm way more ready to kill than this guy is. And that we've seen the results of that. It's not our or not only our results, but when we were working a lot with the 68th Jaeger Brigade, there were there was this group of guys that we spent a lot of time with. And one in particular who was a big Hutsul from West Ukraine. So it's one of the kind of like uh, small Ukrainian subcultural or no sub-ethnic groups, not really ethnic, but anyway, whatever. From the western part of Ukraine, up in the mountains, a Ukrainian mountain man, huge guy, easily 2 meters tall, and ferocious. He was made a senior sergeant and would often lead assaults with his guys from the front, which is what a senior sergeant should be doing. Perfect. But big booming voice, and the Russians in the area, they knew his voice. They knew his voice on the radio because the communications are unencrypted and everyone's listening to each other's. Um, but there was a time where he was leading an assault, and it was 25 Ukrainians. They routed, by which I mean they routed 80 Russians. And when I say routed, I mean the Russians were abandoning their positions and just running because of the ferocity of the assault. And I'm sure these weren't the best Russians out there, but nonetheless, it shows that on the small scale, that level of aggression makes a massive, massive difference. And then you aggregate that throughout forces, and it's this is something that we need to improve on via training. And there's
Mm.
actually there are I'm gonna send you this. There's a link to a news story about this. But there was a news story recently. I think it was Washington Post or something. I don't know. I don't remember exactly where it was published. But they related a story of a bunch of Ukrainian soldiers that deserted, but they deserted as a unit, went back to their home base and demanded two things: more training and more weapons. And they said, "We're willing to fight. We want a fighting chance. We want to be given actual preparation."
That's
And
really
and
interesting. I'm going to jump in there because
yeah,
desertion was going to be my next story because it's very much linked to the Soviet, hierarchy. And it's interesting. You say it's that sort of distributed horizontal Ukrainian culture, which is absolutely a thing. But also, a lot of the young people you're talking about have also inherited something of what I describe as the sort of Silicon Valley approach as well. And I worked for a company there, and I found the culture fascinating because it was very different to British business culture, right? If you run a business, and I'd find this because I do a lot of business networking. So if you run a company and it fails, and you start another, and it fails. And then you're on your third go at it, right? And you've made all these mistakes and you've beaten yourself up, but you've got a lot of learnings on the way. Well, if you go to British investors, or if you go into a lot of, the general impression or culture is like people, it's the shocked intake of breath. Oh dear, oh really, should we be dealing with this guy? Because, you failed twice. That's not great. The attitude was completely different in Silicon Valley. They actively embrace people, unless you're a complete idiot, right? And you've failed clearly because you're doing everything absolutely wrong. It's not like that. They say, okay, well you've done this. What went wrong? What have you learnt from that? And actually, they're actively looking for people to invest in who've gone through those early mistakes because that's a more mature, more valuable person, right? And their third venture has got a better chance of, a higher chance of success. So there's an extraordinary logic underpinning that. There's also a culture of, embracing the ability to make mistakes and move on. So it seems to me that a lot of young people in Ukraine will have, yes, the deep Ukrainian culture, but they'll also have that culture as well of working in startups, working in businesses that move fast, break things, learn, reform, etc. And then they're coming into these units, some of which have, I'm not listening to you, you're nobody and I'm somebody kind of status oriented thing. And that leads clearly some people are going to want to either desert or, as you described here, this is an important nuance, desert and demand better because you really want your country to win. When that story is reported in the West, they don't add that nuance. And I've seen this story actually in media recently. Headline figure, X number of desertions, but there's no context. And there's certainly none of this in extraordinary story that you described here, which is a form of sort of mutiny to actually improve things and give your country a better chance of winning. How did that work out? I'm fascinated to hear.
It's in process. So we haven't seen the conclusion to this, but it's what it is. I can tell. Well, look, I can make a prediction. Usually don't like making predictions, but I feel quite confident on this one. I believe it's going to just contribute to the existing pressure, and we're going to see these training improvements. It's something it's huge for us because we're here saying, please allow us to help enhance your training. Um, in fact, one of the barriers that we've run into recently, this is it's a little bit of a hard cap, working at the level where we are, where at the brigade level, we can, in a large brigade that's kind of left to its own devices, we can do anything we want. And we can replace or augment or supplement. I guess I'm just using synonyms there, but anyhow, official training, because it's not like anyone's coming and staring very very deeply at it. But the higher we go, the more official scrutiny there is, and we are not counted. We have our agreements that we work under. We're still not counted as part of the official training pipeline. I mean, we as an organization. And so that's one of the barriers that we have to cross. But I think that the reason I believe that's going to improve is for what I identified earlier. Training deficits have been identified as an issue by civil society here in Ukraine. People are putting pressure in that direction, and so that's going to open the way for organizations like ours to step forward and say, we're here, we are ready, and we have already been working in this direction. And so I think that we are going to see. I think that these stories are going to lead to a conclusion where we see better trained Ukrainian troops. They're using iterative training processes. They're using natural progression. We think it is crawl, walk, run. They start with the simple individual skills and they move into small scale collective training, squad level maybe, up into higher levels. We're going to see integration of mission command. I think that, and I think that that's going to ultimately be what leads us to victory, because whenever Ukrainian forces have the mass and the opportunity with well-trained units to conduct real maneuver warfare, they melt through the Russians as if the Russians aren't there. And so it's a matter of coordinating and well, training for coordination and making sure that the every like even the soldier down at the private level knows how things work and they know, okay, my boss has some bigger plans that I'm not necessarily privy to, but it's filtered down and I have been made privy to the fact that we, as part of a larger operation, need to secure that building across the street. And that a soldier who knows that he's part of a larger operation and has been given the skills to conduct, to do things down at his level, will fight better. It's these desertions are not. It's not people that want to give up on fighting. It's people that don't have faith in their local leadership and they don't have faith that they are going to. So how it's been put to me, I've had young, fit, intelligent men who are in the conscription age but are avoiding service, not because they don't want to serve, not because they're particularly. I mean, everyone's afraid of dying, but they're not. They're not like that's not the barrier for them. The barrier is if I am required to die serving my nation, I want it to be for a purpose. I want it to be dying, achieving something, not dying because an incompetent commander was too lazy to do any kind of planning and spends his all of his time 40 kilometers behind us. And that's something that we've seen out here. And that's a cultural change that is desperate. It's desperately needed.
And that's
The
another, I mean, to jump in there, that's a
Yeah.
comment which has really, really grated on a lot of people, even some who I think are, we'll stay away from the political labels. But Jake Sullivan came out and he was saying that Ukraine's main problem is that they refuse to lower the conscription age. And yet Zelensky says that there are now battalions that have formed that do not have the equipment. Now, he didn't mention training, but one must assume that if they're not properly equipped, they may not have received the requisite training as well. And it seems that Zelensky does not want to send battalions of people to the front with inadequate training and inadequate equipment. And he certainly doesn't want to harvest, the flower of Ukraine's youth if they are not going to be equipped and trained, because that is mirroring the Russian tactics. Now, without getting political, do you think there is a point here that something needs to change and Ukraine needs more people, but at the same time, allies need to do more, perhaps, certainly in this transition period, to supply Ukraine with what it needs? And some of this stuff isn't necessarily, big long-range missile systems. Some of this may just be the guns and the equipment and the capacity to practice these things before being sent to the front.
So I like to treat things with a lot of gravity in most cases, but Joke Sullivan has no idea what he's talking about. He's completely incompetent, and I think should be uh, just I don't know kicked off a pier and made to swim back onto land. I have nothing but enmity for that man. He's an idiot. So no, the it's not the issue of lowering the conscription age. There are still like there's lots of reporting on the manpower shortage on the Ukrainian side, and there really isn't one. There are a lot of people who can still serve in the even in the 25 and up range. Although there's definitely you shouldn't be sending like 50-year-olds to go on assaults. That's stupid. Um, but no, the I look, I can't comment on the equipment side. The because I see we work with the National Guard. The National Guard does not get a lot of foreign equipment. You see a lot of Soviet legacy stuff, BTRs, things that were produced in Ukraine. You see a lot of that, but no Abrams, uh, which depending on the model, is maybe a blessing more than a curse not having an Abrams. Um, but certainly no Bradleys. And we this that's the kind of stuff that probably is what they need more of. But even do small arms, machine guns. There's I don't know what the situation for small arms is. I've seen because like I've seen army units that just basically go like let's say brand new army units stood up. In one case, we worked closely with one that was it was almost kind of 18th century style of doing things because it was stood up by a wealthy individual, and he was overseeing a lot of the building of the unit. Now later on, he was replaced, and a potentially very strong specialized unit was turned into just another charge, blunt instrument, which is sad. But they got like they were able to get resources to buy brand new small arms, really high end stuff too. So I on the equipment thing, I can't comment, but the training piece, like definitely, and this is there's again, organizations have momentum, and there are a lot of parts of the Ukrainian military that are still training in this goofy, ineffective Soviet style, and that's aside from the kind of elementary school layout of training that I've seen elsewhere. That needs to be improved. These it was 14 brigades that they wanted to build. Uh, the training has to be completely reformed, and it has to follow the real lessons learned that we've seen. Um, and perhaps more is needed from Western partners, but I don't know, as I said, because I don't have that visibility on the equipment side. But if it is a matter of things like small arms and armor, body armor, and whatnot, I can definitely see that as a like, yeah, yes, that need must be filled. But my experience working with the National Guard, because the National Guard is often forced to do more with less, and they do. And so it's kind of like, okay, like how how big of a barrier is it because you can't get, this rifle or that machine gun? Um, but who knows? The holdup could be things like APCs, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, which for those people that don't know, this is a little brief education point. Armored personnel carrier is exactly what it sounds. It moves people and it protects them with armor. An APC does not necessarily stay in the fight, whereas an infantry fighting vehicle, so think APC is an M113. Infantry fighting vehicle is a Bradley. It's got that 25 millimeter cannon. And the idea is it also does bring troops to the fight and then stays there with them as fire support. And both are needed. They fill different roles, both are needed. And so if the holdup is things like IFVs and APCs, yeah, there's nothing for it but to get this stuff out here. And one of the things that I, that again, that Sullivan character saying that, oh, the old Bradleys from the boneyard, they're missing parts, they can't be used. Oh, shut up, you goof. This is like Ukraine has an incredible industrial base, tons and tons of very skilled people. Like you have the milling. So milling in Ukraine is seen as kind of like primitive because they don't have the most advanced CNC machines. But guess what? Those most advanced CFC machines, they can break down a lot more easily, or you can just have denial of service because your licenses are revoked. Whereas the people that are doing milling in Ukraine are doing it by hand, but they've mastered milling, and they're not just some guy pressing a button to execute a computer program. And I bring that up to say that any part that needs to be made can be made in Ukraine. I will not hear anything else because anything else is untrue. Whether it's a bearing or maybe not the most advanced computer boards, but that's not you don't need the most advanced boards for the computers on board an IFV. It doesn't matter because those systems can be made because they are made because Ukraine has a defense industrial base capable of producing a modern Western style infantry fighting vehicle, that being the BTR-4. Super sorry, I'm getting a little technical here, but the
But of
point
course, if you
is
send them 3 units, they could maybe cannibalize it to form 2 functional units, or cannibalize them to keep the units they've got
yes,
going. I mean,
yes.
it's ludicrous. These things are in the desert, gathering dust.
Or just make the parts. The mechanical pieces are very easy to reverse engineer because you take them apart, you measure them, and then you reproduce those mechanical parts. It's and but that's one of those things that I know Jake Sullivan has said is that they can't use these, they can't use these, they're far too that's fucking bullshit, if you'll forgive me for swearing, because it's just not true, and it's we're seeing now there was a real substantive lack of motivation on the part of people like Jake Sullivan and other parts of the Biden administration, um, to fully commit to helping. Like they didn't do everything that they could, and it was always portrayed as this, oh, we have this titanic battle against our political opponents. And then now they're like, turns out there's like 24 billion of unspent presidential drawdown authority. Whoopsie, we're going to try and get it in before the end of the term. The remaining month, are you 20? Like that should enrage people. That should enrage people. And for the partisans who are just never going to let go of their kind of party devotion, whatever, we're not going to reach those people. But for everyone else that is persuadable, we need to be looking back at all of these statements that were made of commitment and yeah, on everything that it takes until victory. Not I'm sorry, as long as it takes, because very few people are saying
Yeah,
until
they don't
victory.
mention victory. No, that's one thing they don't do.
But so these but the point is they made these loud pronouncements, and that didn't match up with the actions, because you don't accidentally leave $24 billion on the table, and these repeated miscalculations of using the brand new system replacement price for a 30-year-old piece of equipment, you don't do that. You do that once as an act by accident. It happening again and again and again within the same administration.
That's by design. That's a sort of smoke and mirrors sort of thing, and it's kind of obscene when it's costing people's lives on that. And also, it's worth putting these figures because it really stunned me. Um, Even if you take the funds that were approved, and as you've pointed out, as Zelenskyy pointed out, that in certain categories, only 10% of the approved material had actually been delivered until recently, which is shocking. But even if you take the fully approved amounts, it is still less than 1% of what was spent on Iraq war. And it is almost a rounding error compared to what was spent on Afghanistan. So here, these vast sums of money have gone on supporting two countries, two wars, which had at best a marginal, some would argue, a practically zero chance of becoming functioning democracies. And here you have a country that embodies the very essence of democratic values, that is striving to emerge from one of the worst slave-minded empires in history, and we're spending a fraction of a fraction on it. I mean, it is actually an obscenity. And then to understand that this stuff hasn't been delivered and people are playing little, bean counter number games with it, it is disgusting and kind of immoral.
Yeah, immoral nails it. And there's now, you mentioning Afghanistan and Iraq, uh, there is valid criticism of the way that those wars were handled, or even I think perhaps the fact that the second Iraq War was even launched, I think is for highly dubious reasons. If we look at the narrative about weapons of mass destruction, um, but it's funny because it's the aftermath of those boondoggles which has proven to be a potent propaganda weapon for our enemy, because there are a lot of Americans who rightfully rightfully look at the horrible defeat in Afghanistan, the collapse of quote unquote democratic Afghanistan, and return to Taliban power, or the return of the Taliban to power, pardon me. Um, they look at that and they look at the expense and the lives that cost, and they're very, very cynical now about war in general. And that's what motivates these people saying, I'm not going to die for this, that, or the other thing. It gets now that gets a little precious because it's like, pal, you live in I don't know, you live in upstate New York, you live in central Idaho, you live in Texas. Nobody is asking you to die, and this escalation. Oh my God, like no, the Russia doesn't have the ability to defeat us here. So they're certainly not going to be coming to you unless, here's the thing, unless we just say give up and allow them to defeat us here, or give them time, or put barriers in Ukraine's way. And that's so it's like the healthy skepticism gets turned into something that could potentially allow for the very outcome that these people are hoping to avoid, when they say, I don't want to die for Ukraine. And it's like, hey, like no one's asking you to. No one will require you to. If if you don't get in the way of enabling Ukraine to win. However, if Russia does manage to win here, and then they manage to reconstitute their forces in another 8 to 10 years, and then they make another run at this time a NATO country because they feel confident that Article 5 will not be respected. That now there's maybe you do find yourself fighting. So it is, the legacy of Afghanistan and Iraq is so it's harmful in so many different ways because it has it for basically 2 generations of people only know in the West only understand a war of choice, and they don't understand an existential defensive war. Many of them don't even believe that uh, such a war can exist. You end up with like kind of the ultimate pacifist thing, which is, oh no, no, if we had just done this or if we had just done that, we could have avoided the war altogether. Not every war is a war of choice, and not on every side is that choice made. This is a war of choice on the Russian side, not on the Ukrainian side. The government here, Zelensky early in his tenure really paid a large price in popularity by trying to adhere to the Minsk agreements. And it really made a sincere effort, and pissed off a lot of the military people who understood the situation better, by being he was very strict on the military, and going after commanders who were firing back defensively when the Russians were the first to break the ceasefire. Uh, but like that was a sincere effort, and that goes to show you that Russia had decided, the Putin and his people had decided now was the time for the invasion. There was no This is not a war of choice on Ukraine's side, and we need to do, you know, I think probably people like us need to find ways to communicate to the persuadable people in the West that this isn't a war of choice. This doesn't resemble Afghanistan. This is not an imposition of Western culture um, onto Ukraine. Like Ukraine has always been democratic. In fact, Ukraine was democratic. Uh, in Now, keeping in mind there's different forms of democracy, but Ukraine was democratic long before any Western democracy existed. It was exercised in different ways. I'm thinking in the way that the Cossacks elected their officers. You still had nobility and stuff like that, but it was not operated in the way that feudalism was in the West. Um, Anyhow, the point is that yeah, it's disgusting. As you said, it is morally disgusting that with the probably I think probably trillions that were thrown away on Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to just take this Western democracy stamp and force it down onto people who didn't have that tradition. And I think in the case of Afghanistan, we can say now with like any argument that they were interested broadly. Of course, there are always people that are interested in democracy, but to say that they were broadly interested in becoming a modern Western style democracy, that's puerile. It's obviously false. Um, but they they wanted other things. There was probably stuff we could have done. Like there are, say what you will about Afghan fathers, but there are certainly some who do want their daughters to know how to read and educate them in secret. There were ways that we could have done a lot better. We need to have our own iterative learning process on, how did we screw up so monumentally in Afghanistan? But that's a completely, I think
Yeah.
probably you need an entirely different podcast for that one. But
Yes, yes. So we could probably talk for hours on that and the various mistakes made in Iraq as well, wiping out the bureaucracy and then expecting a functioning state to emerge. I mean, it's naivety to the point of being extremely dangerous. Well, the last thing I think we should focus on this conversation is bringing that all together. We've got some incredible changes coming up. It's a period of uncertainty. You've highlighted, I think, conclusively that Ukraine needs to be able to look after itself to an extent, fight for itself. It needs to innovate its own solutions to a variety of problems because it cannot necessarily rely on partners to come through every time with those. I think that's an important sort of idea that's emerged here. But there are also conversations about, exhaustion, morale that we've talked about. Are the numbers there? But the media also swings wildly and, between, despair and elation. At the moment, it's in a deep kind of pit of despair. Um, and, we hear about Russia making these extraordinary advances. But when you look at it on a map, it is small slivers of land for absolutely catastrophic losses in terms of equipment and people. We know Russia doesn't care about people, but its resources are not infinite. Its people are not infinite. And we see, them pulling in North Korean soldiers. They're not doing that because they like North Koreans. It's because they're running out of people they can use. They've been raiding gay clubs in Moscow to press gang the people they arrest on the spot into the military. Why are they doing that unless they are running out of people? So some of these nuances don't make it into the media. However, you talked about before we hit record, Keith Kellogg being appointed as Trump's representative, try and bring an end to the war. And this curiously aligns with a real change in Zelensky's rhetoric, which is that Ukraine will never cede territories to Russia. It will never acknowledge Russian ownership or sovereignty over those territories because that is illegal. But Ukraine seems to be open to the idea of freezing those lines of contact with certain security guarantees. And that is a real change in rhetoric, which comes with the appointment of Kellogg. And I think importantly, you've pointed out that Kellogg has actually been to Ukraine and he has seen, not only has he seen service in the US, he's actually been to the front and see how some of these things are playing out. So he may have a far more realistic and far better informed impression of what's going on than, the punch bag of Sullivan that we just mentioned.
so I, it's interesting. I see that the things that Zelensky is saying, but I view it as some. It's hard. Okay, look, I'm bad at interpreting politicians in the best case. I think that there is an implicit understanding here on the part of the Ukrainian government that um, A, we're never going to be in NATO. B, security guarantees. We had security guarantees. It was called the Budapest Memorandum, and that's the reason that we gave up our nuclear weapons. Which a note on that because you have the pro-Russians always saying like, "Oh, the Russians owned those weapons and they had the access code." Okay, whatever. So if you have to disassemble and rebuild the bomb using this, but you have the one of the big barriers. This is the barrier for Iran, fissile material. So I already have the device. I just have to take out certain components and rebuild it. That's not exactly a challenge for in Ukraine, which is Ukraine was pretty much the brain trust of the Soviet Union. So
It's another one of
forget.
these bureaucratic arguments, isn't it? It's one of these obscure bureaucratic arguments that is designed to either, it's a bit of arse covering, but it's also designed to result in inaction. It's
Yes,
just little sound bites that are designed to move on and not take action, but which actually are just bullshit.
precisely. And so the there's this understanding that security guarantees are worthless without having troops on the ground. there won't be troops on the ground. I think it's staking out of a strong position. Now, will it be understood this way? I hope so. I hope that Kellogg is up to the task, and I hope that he has people who can help him understand Ukrainian culture. Um, but I also think that they're responding in a way that they're negotiating the way that Trump himself negotiates by making strong pronouncements and then, setting that out as a beginning negotiating position and allowing themselves to be talked in one direction or another. But no, I do believe that there is an implicit understanding that we won't be in NATO. I don't think I personally, that's what I believe. I don't think that we'll ever be able to get past the approval process because there are Hungary and Slovakia who have to approve of us to coming in. Um, but that doesn't mean that we can't be an important non-NATO ally. We have New Zealand, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Israel. These are all not NATO countries, but are very close to the NATO, the various members of the NATO alliance, often through bilateral agreements. And I think that Ukraine can occupy a position like that. Um, but it is also important that these statements are made. We do not acknowledge we do not cede this territory. That leaves room later on if I would view this as perhaps one of the worst possible outcomes. Ceding the territory in any freezing the front line, any of this stuff that gets floated. Sorry, I'm emotional about this stuff, so it gets me swearing. But
I think the
or
idea might be, just to sort of float it there, the idea might be that you do not cede sovereignty of those territories. It's a kind of semi-permanent pause, and we know that with Russia, no pause is permanent.
yeah,
But Russia may well collapse. There is a scenario in the First World War where Russia lost a whole bunch of territory because it capitulated to the Germans. The Germans then lost. Russia got it back in spades. So, and there may be a little bit of creative thinking there, but if it's purely coming out of exhaustion, then maybe, yeah, maybe it's not the best strategy.
no, I think if there's going to be a Russian collapse, it's because we made it happen. I'm not a like Personally, I'm very skeptical about the narrative that we've had on our side of Russian collapse, just because I've been hearing about this impending Russian collapse for 3 years. It's like, the walls are closing in on Russia. Sure they are. Sure they are. Um, I think that we need to force them out, and we don't do that by running head on head in attritional warfare. We do that by taking the approach of Brazilian jiu-jitsu rather than boxing. And we outposition them using maneuver warfare because that's totally possible to do. That is, many superior forces have been superior on paper, have been defeated by numerically inferior forces through a better use of maneuver. There is precedent for these things. And so we just need to get Ukrainian forces up to that the ability to use that maneuver. But I also think that it must happen because Russia is already ethnically cleansing the areas that they have occupied. They are already moving in their little colonists, which is what they always do. That's going to be a big enough problem for us to clear out the numbers that they've already brought in. And it's going to be relatively easy now because it's going to go, look, if you don't have a Ukrainian passport hanging out anywhere at home and you don't have proof of Ukrainian citizenship before, you gotta go. But if we spool this out 20, 30 years and there's a couple generations of people born in those children of colonists, then when we try to say you have to leave, there's going to be this hue and cry from the international community that we are the ones doing ethnic cleansing. And now, if like Azerbaijan, you have the allies and economic backing to make certain moves despite international censure, then you can ethnically cleanse an area. But I don't think that it's appropriate for a democracy to do. And so let's just get ahead of that problem by not letting it happen. Push them out now and say, look, you colonists have to leave. Um, it's I don't believe that okay. People talk about the Korean. Oh, there could be a Korean scenario. How is that working for South Korea? Having this insane rogue state in the East Asian region very badly. It is a terrible. That was a dog shit solution. And what's more is it's not necessary because the reason that we needed a Korean solution or Korean style solution, the armistice there, was because there was a nuclear China. In this case, we're fighting the nuclear Russia, and we know that their nuclear threats are just, for God's sake, their red lines have been broken time and again. So we know that we can push them out. Like really, we understand this. It always kind of makes me laugh because as a proud resident of the first city that would be nuked by Russia if they decided to make that move, that being Kyiv, I've gone to bed ever since the first year when things were kind of turning against them and they were not getting the progress they wanted. I've gone to bed thinking, you know, it's not impossible that I'm annihilated by nuclear fire. And it's I can understand there are people who are scared of that. You it's logical. I have certain values that to me anyway, it doesn't just don't need to get into like I don't want to die, but I'm also not like shaking in my boots at the prospect of my death. That may change when I'm lucky enough to become a father, but I've gone to bed thinking, oh yeah, maybe we get nuked. I've worried less and less about that as time's gone on, and we haven't gotten nuked. Now that might just be a fallacy of my thinking, but I think it's actually borne out by the fact that Russia always says this is a red line and starts making nuclear threats, always vague nuclear threats, and then the red line gets crossed and they move the red line, and then the nuclear threats stay vague. So, like the people in the West that have actual anti-missile defenses, like things like THAAD or Archer or Aegis, like the high. I don't know if Aegis is very high altitude, but I know THAAD anyway. Whatever stuff that could actually shoot down an ICBM in its glide phase. Like, what are you guys? Why are you guys so scared? That's my. It's kind of like we're out here at the front, and we're not nearly as scared as you. And so I just we need the West to kind of collectively find their minerals and say, yeah, it's time to just draw an actual line and actually start moving towards victory. Now, that's when I say the West, I'm overgeneralizing because not every Western leader is like Scholz, and not every national government is like the ones that are on the weaker end. The Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania to a degree, Czechia, they're all very strong and they're all very forward. That's one of the things that we're hoping to make some connections with those governments because they seem to be the ones that are most likely to support activity inside the country, and they are not afraid, and they're the ones usually. Well, the Nordics and the Baltics are the ones closest, other than us, to this fight because they've got Russia right there on their doorstep making territorial claims, even in the case of the Baltics, trying to move the sea borders. So if they're that brave, then that's good. It's an example to show to others in the West who are actually terrified of very vague threats from the Russians. Um, it's gone. I've wandered a little bit from the topic of conversation, but I think that it's important that we stake out maximalist positions. And I mean, were I president, I'd be starting to talk about the historical significance of the Ukrainian speaking population in Rostov, and in asking who founded Bilhorod, the Ukrainian pronunciation of that city. Um, just to stake out like a ridiculous position that has people negotiating me back to, okay, fine, we'll accept the 1991 borders. It's we when you're in a fight for these maximum stakes, you need to have maximum aggression, and maximum war goals. And anything else, if we it's like in the beginning when so many the Biden administration was terrible for this. They set out by saying, okay, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to, it's like, you do not help your negotiating position that way. And I think that if the administration here and the leadership here do their job well enough, they will be able to reach Trump in that way because that is his style of negotiation. So that's again a very very long and detailed and sometimes digressing answer is the strategy that our government here needs to take because I think it's the one that they need to. Um, but we'll see. We'll see. I'm seeing a lot of in the stuff that I know, the stuff that I'm closest to, we're seeing really good signs, and we're seeing movement towards the kind of progress that we want. And so I hope that that's the case in other sectors that I'm less familiar with.
And of course, one of the points that I made in a recent video is that coming from the sort of mafia-ridden New York property industry, it's quite possible that Trump has a slightly better understanding of the so-called Moscow rules, which are essentially very similar to mafia extortion rackets, basically.
Russia's a criminal organization that has a gas station. It is exactly that. And it's one of, I mean, Trump's a lot of people see him as being very vulgar, but I think, I mean, I don't want people to jump on me. I'm not taking a partisan point here, but I think there are certain types of people that you need for certain times, in a historical sense, and I believe that there's a good chance that Trump is the kind of leader America needs in these times because we talk about the world order, the rules-based world order. Now that look, my personal belief is that doesn't exist. I think essentially relations between nations have and always will be anarchic. But we are facing an unprecedented. No, it is precedented. What am I saying? We are facing in our lifetimes a heightened instability in the world. We are seeing these authoritarians, people like Xi, like the mullahs in Iran, uh, obviously like Putin and his coterie, Kim. We're seeing them kind of feel themselves and feel their power and say, "All right, it's time for a multipolar era. An American hegemony must end, and it's time for the I don't know the red star of post communism or whatever you want to. I don't know that you can nail these guys all under one ideology, but authoritarianism. It's time for the star of authoritarianism to rise. It's like, okay, as if that hasn't been the mode of most of history. But they're feeling their power and they're stretching their muscles and they're getting out in the world and saying, I'm going to take what I see as mine. And we do not need Chamberlains. Don't need them. We need Churchills. And like Churchill was imperfect and he got screwed in the end. Attlee was a jackass, but we need Churchills. We need Pattons. We need a lot of people say there's no such thing as great men in history, but there are many great people in history. We write a lot about them for that reason, and
Unfortunately,
we
for good or ill, I mean, part of the mess
yeah
we're in is because Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was an extraordinary character and
mhm,
inflicted extraordinary evil on the world, which is still with us today. So yes,
yes
great men and women
yeah
have a role.
no and Genghis much would be different if Genghis Khan hadn't destroyed Kievan Rus. But we deal with what we have before us, not with what should or could be. And so the point is that in this time, we do need those great people to stand up, and that's it's I'm not going to get myself in trouble if I do anything that sounds like praising Donald Trump, but perhaps Trump is one of those. Perhaps Kellogg is one of those. Perhaps we know Kaya Kallas. She's now with the EU. Um, oh God, I'm brain farting here. The former Prime Minister of Finland. Very dynamic woman. Everyone yelled at her for dancing.
Yeah,
Everyone on
no,
the
you've got
internet.
me too. I can't quite recall, but we'll look it up
What a
after.
couple of sexists we are. But anyway, but no, I mean, this is the point. Is like those are those great leaders, those great people who will stand out in history for the role that they played and the decisions they made. And that this is the time when they are needed. We don't, you can have bookkeepers, you can have people that keep one hand on the tiller and another hand in the till. You can have people like that in an era like the 90s because everything's more or less drifting on the security and success that was secured by earlier generations. But now, once you re-enter the era of historical forces and Francis Fukuyama is proven wrong, you need to go back to the great people, and you need those great leaders to be allowed to rise up and show their strength in the face of these challenges. And you know that whatever form they take, I'll take it. I'll take it because
And he
the
needs them to be
alternative
on the
is to
side
have
of pluralism and democracy as opposed
yes.
to the other
Oh,
guy's side, the
I
authoritarian side. We don't want great leaders on that side.
no, we want great good leaders. And I want I want absolute useless ones on the bad side. I want the bad side to be reduced to such a position of weakness and helplessness that they cannot resist us. I'm it's I have a very very hard drawn moral sense. I don't talk about it a lot publicly, but I'm Catholic and I'm very Catholic, and I believe that there is an absolute good and an absolute evil, and I believe that those good that good and evil are represented uh, in the world and in individuals. Um, but I want I talked about maximalist goals. Like I'm rooting for maximum triumph of good, absolute desolation on the side of evil. I want them broken and scattered, and that doesn't mean I want the Russian people broken and scattered. I want the system that has kept the Russian people as slaves to be broken and scattered. And if that means Russia breaks up into its constituent nations, all the better. But I want for those people prosperity and freedom. Now, I'm not ever going to go there and deliver prosperity and freedom to them. I just want to smash apart the system. I want to play my part in smashing apart the system that keeps them down. Um, and then let them decide their own path. But I want them to lean towards the good, and I think many will if given the opportunity to. We'll
Well, here's a
see.
topic for us to pick up in the next one because we've come to the
Yeah,
end of this one. But it strikes me that Putin is not one of those great leaders. He is someone who's simply been able to exercise his malicious power almost in a vacuum, in the absence of the good guys, in the absence of Western will to enforce its actions and to adopt moral foreign policy. It's allowed these authoritarians to expand into that space. We could talk about that one for a long time, so we'll save that to the next discussion. For today, Kevin, always a huge pleasure, and I think today was probably one of our most considered and fascinating conversations. I hope the audience sort of share that thought as well on that, and it has a positive reaction. Until the next time, good luck with everything you're doing, and yeah, still look forward to meeting in the real world for a beer, which may
absolutely.
happen sooner rather than later. Let's hope.
Fingers crossed. And thank you for having me on again.